Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now, and will be easier to solve while rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy Time Tales for a few nights to get used to the slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. Sleepy Time Tales is a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going to keep paying for the services and tools that I use and justify the time that I spend on it, thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you find Sleepy Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night and you would like to keep it going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, and you have the means to help me keep it going, please consider supporting on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is a monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but can get you fun bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along there, take a look, and sign up if you're willing and you have the means. If monthly seems a big ask though, and I understand that because times are tough for a lot of people, you can make once-off tips to the tip jar on the website. I do want to emphasize though, if you can't support the show financially, please don't feel guilty about it. As I say, times are tough for everyone, and I'm not here to make things worse. But if you would like to support the show without having to help financially, you can just simply spread the word. Whether in person or on social media, if you meet someone or hear about someone who struggles to sleep and you think I might be able to help them, just tell them about Sleepy Time Tales. It's all that it takes. And that's enough of that. Let's get on with the relaxing stuff. It's been a while, but we return tonight to Periods of European History, Dark Ages, by Charles Oman, Fellow of All Souls College and lecturer at New College in Oxford. And we pick up with Theodoric, King of Italy. From the formal and constitutional point of view, the substitution of King Theodoric for King Odoacer as ruler in Italy made no change in the position of affairs. From the practical point of view, the change was important, for the new Teutonic kingdom was very much stronger than the old. Its ruler was a younger and far abler man, the wisest and most far-sighted of all the Germans of the 5th and 6th centuries. Moreover, the military power of the Ostrogoths was far greater than that of the mixed multitude of federati who had followed Odoacer. They were a numerous tribe, confident of their own valor after a century of successful war, and devotedly attached to the king, who for the last 20 years had never failed to lead them to victory. While they preserved their ancient courage, they had acquired by a stay of 3 generations, within bounds of the empire, a higher level of civilization than any other of the Teutonic tribes. Their dress, their armor, their manner of life showed traces of their intercourse with Rome. They had been Christians for a century and had forgotten many of the old heathen and barbarous customs of their ancestors. They possessed too, first of all Teutonic peoples, the germ of written literature in the famous Gothic Bible of Ulfilas. There are documents surviving, written in the character which Ulfilas had devised for his people, which show that there were Gothic clergy and even laymen who could commit their contracts to paper in their own tongue. Theodoric himself never learned to write, but there must have been many among his subjects who could do so. Though the king actually discouraged the Goths from giving themselves up to book learning, yet in the generation which followed him there were Goths skilled both in Roman and Greek literature, some even who called themselves philosophers and claimed to follow Plato. Of all the German nations, it seems that the Ostrogoths were the most suited to form the nucleus for a new kingdom, which should grow up as a young and strong yet civilized state on the ruins of the Roman Empire. And if any one man could have brought such a consummation to pass, Theodoric was certainly the most fitted for the task. 10 years spent as a hostage at Constantinople had shown him the strong and the weak points in the Roman system of administration. 20 years spent in the field at the head of his tribesmen had won him an experience in war, both with Roman and barbarian, that made him unequaled as a general. Italian statesmen found him a mastermind who could comprehend all difficulties of the administration of an empire. Gothic warriors looked up to him not only as the most skillful marshaller of a host, but also as the stoutest lance in his own army. Unlike when he smote the Gepidae by the Danube, and when he drove the Federati of Odoacer into the Adige, the king had himself headed the final and decisive charge that broke the shield wall of the enemy. But Theodoric was even more than a great statesman and warrior. He was a man of wide mind and deep thought. His practical wisdom took shape in numerous proverbs which his subjects long treasured, and in spite of one or two deep stains on his character, we may say that his brain was inspired by a sound and righteous heart. The essential justice and fairness of his mind shines out in his official correspondence, even when enveloped in the obscure and grandiloquent verbiage of his secretary Cassiodorus. Among all the Teutonic kings, he was the Justimus Unus and Serventus Equi, who set himself to curb the violence of the Goth, no less than the chicanery of the Roman, and taught both that he was no respecter of persons, but a judge set upon the throne to deal out an even-handed justice. Alone among all rulers, Roman or German in his day, he was a believer without tending in the least to become a persecutor. No monarch for 1,000 years to come could have been found to echo Theodoric's magnificent declaration that religion is a thing which the king cannot command, because no man can be compelled to believe against his will. Though an Arian himself, he employed Catholics, Gothic and Roman, as freely as those of his own sect. Even the Jews got strict justice from him, when every other state in the world dealt hardly with them. The abuse which he won from fanatical Christians for resenting the mobbing of a rabbi, or the profanation of a synagogue, is one of the highest testimonies in his praise. The benefits of justice, he said, must not be denied, even to those who err from the faith. Yet he was not, as were some others who tolerated Jews, a semi-pagan or an agnostic. The very rescripts which grant temporal justice to the oppressed Hebrews end with an appeal to them to leave their hard-heartedness and flee from the wrath to come. In managing the settlement of his victorious tribesmen on the soil of Italy, Theodoric showed much ability. The third of the land, which Odoacer had confiscated 17 years before, seemed to have sufficed for their establishment. The greater part of the Federati who had been holding this third had fallen in battle, and those who escaped the Gothic sword seem mostly to have perished in a simultaneous outbreak of riot and murder, by which the Italians celebrated the downfall of Odoacer, when they heard that he had been finally shut up in Ravenna. Hence Theodoric was able to provide for his countrymen without further spoliation of the native proprietors. He threatened indeed for a moment to deprive of their lands and rights those Italians who adhered too long to Odoacer. But better counsel prevailed, and even those men were spared. So the Goths settled down with little friction among the new subjects. They lay thickly along the valley of the Po and the Pasanim, more sparsely scattered in Tuscany and central Italy. Into the south few seem to have penetrated. Nearly all settled down to farm the countryside. Only in the royal towns of Ravenna, Pavia, and Verona did the Goths become an appreciable element in the urban population. Theodoric's plan for dealing with the government of conquered Italy deserves careful study. He did not abolish the remains of the Roman administrative system which he found still existing. Nor did he, on the other hand, endeavor to subject the Goths to Roman law. He was content, for a time, two systems of administration should go on side by side. The Goths were to be ruled and judged by his counts, the Gothic governors whom he set up over each Italian province, his aldermen, as an Anglo-Saxon would have called them, according to the traditional folk rights of their tribe. The Romans looked for justice to magistrates of their own race. If a Goth and a Roman went to law, the case was heard before the count and the Italian judge, sitting together on the same bench. In the central administration, the same mixture of systems was to be seen. Theodoric's court was like that of another German king in many ways. He had about him his personal retinue of military retainers, the king's men, whom the Goths called by the name of Scions, but whom in writing our own English history we should call them Thanes or Guesseths. The Scions went on the king's errands, served him in bower and hall, and acted as his bodyguard on the battlefield. Above their rank and file rose 2 or 3 more prominent followers who seemed to represent the great officers of the household of the later Middle Ages, such as were the chamberlain and the great captains who in Roman usage were styled magisteri militum, and the king's high butler and steward. But beside his Teutonic court, the hounds of the royal hall, as Brutus called them, Theodoric kept up a full establishment of Roman officials, bearing the old titles that had been used under the empire: praetorian prefects, masters of the offices, quaestors and notaries. He showed great skill and discretion in choosing the most honest among his Italian subjects for these posts, so that his courtiers never became an oppressive official clique, as had habitually been the case under the later emperors. He even chose as his praetorian prefect Liberius, who had adhered to Odoacer to the last, and told him that he esteemed him all the more for his fidelity to his first master. The best men in Italy were undoubtedly set to administer the central government, but it was Theodoric's misfortune that the better the man, the more likely he was to indulge in vain dreams of old Roman glory, and to resent in his heart the wise rule of the Ostrogoth. Photius, the last of the Romans as he may be called, served Theodoric all his life without learning true loyalty to him. We have not space to notice half of Theodoric's reforms in the administration of Italy. Most wise among them was the careful restoration of the old roads, aqueducts, and drainage canals, which had been the glory of the early empire. He was himself a great builder, and erected royal palaces at Verona and Ravenna, of which, alas, only the smallest fragments survive. But he spent even greater care in keeping up ancient edifices. In Rome he set apart every year 200 pounds weight of gold for the repair of palaces and public buildings. He took under his protection even statues and monuments, and added representations of himself to the crowd of effigies which adorned Rome. So thoroughly did he put himself in the place of the Caesars, that he even took care to celebrate games in the circus, and harangued the assembled people in the forum. He attended and took part in the debates of the Senate, and endeavored to strengthen it by the appointment of a few Gothic senators. If he showed some unwisdom in arranging for the resumption of the bread dole, which had been such a curse to Rome, he atoned for it by a liberal scheme for the arrangement of taxes, which had once relieved the people and filled the treasury. At his death, the royal hoard at Ravenna amounted to no less than 40,000 pounds weight of gold, 1,600,000 pounds in hard cash. Theodoric's wise administration at home was accompanied by an equally firm and able foreign policy. His first care was to establish friendly relations with the Eastern Empire. Even before Odoacer had met his death, he dispatched an embassy to report to Zeno that he had carried out his commission of conquering Italy, and claimed an imperial confirmation of his title. But the embassy found Zeno just dead, and his successor, Anastasius, engrossed in the suppression of riots and rebellions. It was not till 497 that the emperor recognized the king of the Goths as ruler in Italy. Then, however, Anastasius made up for his tardy recognition by sending to Theodoric the regalia which Odoacer had forwarded to Zeno 20 years before, the robes and palace ornaments, which had last been used by the boy Romulus Augustulus. During the 33 years of Amal's reign in Italy, he had only one dispute with the emperor. This was a frontier quarrel in 505, caused by troubles in Illyricum. Theodoric had taken in hand the restoration of the bounds of the Western Empire towards the east, and his generals, having subdued Pannonia as far as Sirmium and Sigidinum, trespassed onto Moesian soil, and came into contact with the East Roman armies. There was some trouble for 3 years, but no great war. Though in 508, 2 of Anastasius's generals made a destructive raid on Apulia. But peace was ultimately made on the terms that the boundary should be drawn, as in the days of the Western Empire, at the Save and Danube. Much more important were Theodoric's dealings with his neighbors to the west and north. He took over the task of Odoacer in guarding the old Roman districts beyond the Alps, which had once composed the provinces of Rhaetia and Noricum. Both are now becoming Teutonic rather than Latin-speaking lands. Into Rhaetia had fled many of the Alemanni, or Suabians, when Clodovic the Frank in 496 drove them out of their lands on the Main and Neckar. This people gladly acknowledged Theodoric as overlord, in return for his protection against the pursuing Franks, whom the Ostrogoth bade halt at the line of the Upper Rhine between Basel and Constance. Further east in Noricum, the place of the immigrant Roman provincials, had now been taken by a mixed Teutonic population. The remnant of the broken clans of the Rugians, Syri, and Tocaligi, who were just beginning to call themselves by the common name of Bavarians, under which we now know them so well a few years later. They too, like the Alemanni, were glad to acknowledge Theodoric as suzerain and pay him tribute. To the west, Theodoric at his ascension found his kingdom bound by the Alps, for Odoacer had given up to the Visigoths Marseille, and the other towns which had obeyed the emperor down to the year 476. Beyond the Alps, Alaric the Visigoth now held the mouths of the Rhone and the Provençal coast, while Gundobad the Burgundian ruled on the middle and upper Rhone, from Avignon as far as Bressignon and Langres. North of both Burgundian and Visigoth, and far from the alpine borders of Theodoric, lay the new Frankish kingdom of Clodovic, now reaching as far as the Loire and the Upper Seine. With all these 3 monarchs, the king of the Ostrogoths had many dealings. At the very beginning of his reign, he had asked for the hand of Agofleda, the sister of Clodovic, and hoped that by this alliance he had bound the clever and unscrupulous Frank to himself. By August later, he became the father of Amalasuintha, the only child born to him in lawful wedlock, though he had two elder daughters by a concubine ere he came to Italy. Soon after his own marriage with the Frankish princess, Theodoric wedded one of these natural children to Sigismund, the son and heir of the Burgundian Gundobad, and the other to Alaric the Visigoth. Thus all his neighbours became his relatives. But this did not secure peace between the new kinsmen of Theodoric. In 499, Clodovic fell on Gundobad to strip him of his realm and routed him, and shut him up in Avignon, the southernmost of his strongholds. But after many successes, the Frank lost all that he had gained, and turned instead to attack the king of the Visigoths. Theodoric strove unsuccessfully to prevent both wars, and was not a little displeased when in 507 his brother-in-law, Clodovic, overran southern Gaul, and slew his son-in-law Alaric in battle. Burgundian and Frank then united to destroy the Visigoths, and might have done so had not Theodoric intervened. The heir of the Visigoth throne was now Amalric, the son of Alaric, and of the king of Italy's daughter. To defend his grandson's realm, Theodoric declared war, both on Clodovic and on Gundobad, and sent his armies over the Alps to save the remnants of the Visigoth possessions in Gaul. One host crossed the Cottian Alps and fell on Burgundy. Another entered Provence and smote the Frank and Burgundian besiegers of Arles. With his usual good fortune, Theodoric recovered all Gaul south of the Durance and the Cevennes, so that the conquests of Clodovic were confined to Aquitaine. The way was now clear for the Ostrogothic armies to march into Spain, to support the claims of the child Amalric against Gesalic, a bastard son of Alaric II, who had been proclaimed king of the Visigoths at Barcelona. After 2 years of guerrilla fighting, the pretender was hunted down and slain, though he had sought and obtained some help from the Vandal king, Thrasimund. For the next 14 years, till Amalric reached manhood, Theodoric ruled Spain in his grandson's behalf. He was recognized as king of the Visigoths in common with Amalric, and ruled both halves of the Gothic race, reunited after an interval of 200 years with equal authority. And his royal mandates ran in Spain as well as in Italy. His delegate was Count Theudis, an Ostrogothic noble who was made regent, and ruled at Narbonne over all the Visigothic realm west of the Rhone, while the Roman Liberius, named Praetorian Prefect of Gaul, administered Visigothic Provence from the ancient city of Arles. Theodoric's power was now supreme from Sirmium to Cadiz, and from the upper Danube to Sicily. He ruled the larger half of the old Roman Empire of the West, and exercised much influence in Gaul and Africa, the two parts of it that were not absolutely in his hands. After the War of 507-10, Clodovic the Frank had died, and his 4 sons who parted his realm made peace with the Ostrogoth, while Gundobad, the Burgundian king, had been fain to follow their example even earlier. 12 years of peace followed, 511 to 523, before Theodoric, now in extreme of old age, had occasion to interfere in Gaul. Sigismund, the husband of Theodoric's elder natural daughter, was now king of the Burgundians. He was a gloomy and suspicious tyrant, and drew down the wrath of Theodoric by murdering his own heir, Sigeric, who was the Gothic king's eldest grandson. To punish this crime, Theodoric leagued himself with the Franks and attacked Burgundy. He conquered and took as his share of the spoil the lands between Durance and Drôme, with the cities of Avignon, Orange, and Viviers, the farthest extension to the northwest of the Ostrogothic Empire. The circle of family alliances which Theodoric had made with his European neighbours was extended even beyond the Mediterranean. He married his sister, Amalfrida, a widowed princess, no longer in her first youth, to Thrasimund, the old king of the Vandals. In virtue of his connection, he seems to have treated Thrasimund as a younger brother, if not as a vassal. When the Vandal dared to help the usurper Gesalic in Spain, Theodoric imposed a tribute on him and bade him for the future to do nothing without the counsel of his wife Amalfrida. Thrasimund did not resent this treatment, and for the future did all he could to perpetuate his brother-in-law. The Vandal state indeed was not in a condition to risk a quarrel with Theodoric. Ever since the death of Huneric, it had been steadily on the decline. In the reigns of Gunthermund, 484 to 496, and Thrasimund himself, 496 to 523, it was continually losing ground to the insurgent Moors of Atlas. Gunthermund, who was not a persecutor like his predecessor Huneric, had endeavored to win the favor of the Catholics by allowing them to recall their exiled bishops and open their churches. But these boons did not check the falling away of his subjects, and during his reign the Moors conquered from him the whole seacoast, from Tangiers to the gates of Caesarea. His brother Thrasimund tried the opposite policy, resumed the persecutions, deported 200 Catholic bishops to Sardinia, and renewed the horrors of the days of Huneric. Naturally, he was no more fortunate in dealing with the native rebels than his brother had been. A quarrel with Theodoric would have meant ruin, so he kept himself from all foreign war. He died in 523 at a great age, killed, it is said, by the news of a great defeat which his armies had suffered at the hands of the Moors. His successor was his cousin Hilderic, the son of Huneric, and the Roman princess Eudocia, the last scion of the house of Theodosius the Great. Educated by a Catholic mother, Hilderic was himself the first Orthodox Vandal king, and ended the long African persecutions. But his reign was not happier than those of his two cousins. His enthusiastic championship of the Catholic cause brought him into collision with the bulk of his Vandal subjects, and he was attacked by a rebellious party, headed by Theodoric's sister, the Queen Dowager Amalfrida, who wished to proclaim as King of Africa one of her late husband's nephews. Hilderic had the better of the fighting, defeated the rebels, and captured Amalfrida, whom he consigned to a dungeon, to the great wrath of her brother, the King of the Goths. As long as Theodoric lived, he immediately kept her in close confinement. But the moment he heard of the old man's death in 526, he had the cruelty to slay the aged queen, a deed which alienated forever the Vandals and the Ostrogoths. The captivity of his sister was not the only sorrow which clouded the last few years of Theodoric's long life. He was left in some trouble as to the succession to his crown. He had married his only legitimate child, Amalsuintha, to a Visigothic prince named Eutharic, of whose prudence and valor much was expected. Theodoric intended him to reign with his daughter as colleague and king consort, but in 522 Eutharic died, leaving as his heir a boy of only 5 years of age. Theodoric could not but see that on his death the accession of a woman and a child to the throne would be fraught with the gravest danger, more especially as his nephew, Theodot, the nearest male heir of the Amal house, was known to be an unscrupulous intriguer. It was perhaps owing to a temper embittered by these family troubles that Theodoric was led, during the last few years of his life, into an unhappy quarrel with some of the best of his Italian subjects. Rightly or wrongly, he had imbibed a notion that the Italians would take advantage of his death to stir up the emperor at Constantinople against his infant heir. The idea was very justifiable, for in spite of all Theodoric's wisdom and goodness, most of his Roman subjects never learned to look kindly upon a ruler who was at once an Arian and a Goth. And it seems that some, at least, of the Senate were secretly corresponding with the Emperor Justin. That monarch, the first Eastern emperor for 50 years who was indisputably orthodox, had fired the enthusiasm of Catholics all over the world by his attempts to suppress Arianism, and the faithful in Italy were undoubtedly contrasting his action with the strict impartiality of Theodoric to the latter's disadvantage. In 524, the patrician Albinus was accused by Cyprian, the Magister Officiorium, of sending disloyal letters to Constantinople. At his trial, he was defended by the consular Boethius, at once a great official and the best-known author of the day, noted as philosopher, theologian, astronomer, and mechanist. In short, the chief representative of the intellect of Italy. Boethius resented the impeachment of Albinus in the most fiery terms. "If this man is guilty," he cried, "then both I and all the Senate are guilty too." The accuser, Cyprian, proceeded to take him at his word, and brought forth further evidence to prove that Boethius himself had been one of the senators in correspondence with Justin, or had at least done his best to suppress evidence against those who actually were so engaged. Such an accusation, even if not fully proved, seems to have fired the anger of the old king. He could not tolerate disloyalty in a man whom he had always distinguished by his favor and preferred to the highest offices. By his orders, Boethius was put on trial before the Senate and there condemned. For a year, Theodoric kept him in prison, a year invaluable to future ages, for in it the captive composed his Consolation of Philosophy, a work which was to be the comfort of many a noble but unhappy soul in the Middle Ages, and to find countless readers from King Alfred down to Sir Thomas More. At the end of a year's confinement, Boethius was tortured and put to death. Possibly he was altogether innocent of the charge laid to his account, that of secret correspondence with Constantinople. But more probably he had actually written harmless letters, to which a treasonable purpose was read by the malice of his accusers and the fears of the king. The death of Boethius was followed by another execution, that of his aged father-in-law, Symmachus, the chief of the Senate, whom Theodoric put to death on the mere suspicion that he resented his son-in-law's cruel end. There seems to have been no further charge laid against him, and no formal trial, so that this action ranks with the murder of Odoacer as the second unpardonable sin of Theodoric's life. Others also suffered during the last 2 years of the old king's reign. In anger at Justin's persecution of the Arians, he threatened reprisals against the Catholics of Italy, and charged John, the Bishop of Rome, to sail at once to Constantinople, and inform the emperor that further persecution would mean war with the Goths, and involve an attack on the Orthodox throughout the Ostrogothic dominions. Moved by these threats, Justin suspended his harrying of the Arians, and treated the Pope with such respect and distinction that he roused the suspicions of the King of Italy. Theodoric thought that John had been too friendly with the emperor, and suspected that the honors and reverence shown him at Constantinople were part of a plan for seducing away the allegiance of his Roman subjects. When the Pope returned, he was thrown into prison, where being already in ill health, he soon died. He was at once hailed as a martyr by the Western Church in 526. The Italians thought that the execution of Symmachus and the imprisonment of Pope John foreboded a general persecution throughout Italy. It was rumored that the Arians had won from the king his consent to an edict closing the Catholic churches, and that the Goths were to take arms against their fellow subjects. Considering the tenor of the whole of Theodoric's previous life, it is most improbable that he had any such wild scheme of intolerance in hand. But he had certainly grown gloomy, suspicious, and hard in his declining days, and it was well for his fame, as well as for his subjects, that he was carried off by dysentery not long after the death of Pope John. It would have been still better, both for king and people, had the end come 3 years earlier, before his first harsh dealings with Boethius. His unpopularity at the moment of his death is shown by the survival of several curious legends, which tell how holy hermits saw his soul dragged down to hell by the injured ghosts of John and Symmachus, or carried off by the fiend himself. So after reigning 33 years over Italy and 12 years over Spain, Theodoric died, aged 72, and was buried by the Goths in the round mausoleum outside the gate of Ravenna, which he had built for himself many years before. His body has long disappeared, but his empty tomb still survives, well nigh the only perfect and unbroken monument that recalls the 60 years of Gothic dominion in Italy. And with the death of Theodoric, we're going to call it a night for tonight. If you would like to pick up where we've left off, you can, as always, find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night and sweet dreams.